The sun beat down on the cracked earth, baking the silence until it shimmered. Alara shielded her eyes, watching the dust cloud approach. It wasn't a storm. It was men. Apache men, their forms hardening against the heat haze. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced the relentless torpor that had settled over her since her husband's passing. Alone on this desolate claim, miles from anywhere, she was a lone, vulnerable sparrow in a hawk's sky. The small shack offered scant protection, the wind whistling through the gaps in the wood a constant reminder of her isolation. Each sunset was a surrender to the encroaching darkness, each sunrise a weary greeting to another day of struggle and gnawing loneliness. Survival was a brutal negotiation with the land and whatever cruelties it harbored. They stopped a respectful distance away, but their presence was a heavy weight in the air. 3 of them, faces impassive, eyes like obsidian chips. The oldest, his face a roadmap of harsh years, dismounted slowly. He didn't carry a rifle openly, but the knife on his belt gleamed. Alara stood rooted, her hands trembling as she gripped the rough wood of the doorframe. Her breath hitched in her throat. She understood a few words of their language, remnants from trading post interactions, enough to grasp the gist of what they sometimes sought. They wanted supplies, perhaps water or passage. Never this. The old man raised a hand, not in greeting, but holding something. A leather pouch, heavy with the clink of metal. He spoke in a low, guttural tone, his eyes fixed on her, assessing. He spoke of her aloneness, of the dangers for a woman without a man. Then the words shifted, became clearer, sharper, like shards of flint. He spoke of her youth, her untouched state. He spoke of the pouch, the silver coins within. An offer, for her innocence. The air grew impossibly still. The heat seemed to amplify the pounding of her heart, the blood rushing in her ears. Shame washed over her, hot and sickening, quickly followed by a primal terror. She wasn't just vulnerable. She was prey. The coins weren't payment. They were the price of her dignity, her safety, perhaps her very life. Her mind raced, searching for escape, for a weapon, for a miracle. There was none. The vast, empty land offered no sanctuary, only witnesses to her despair. She couldn't fight them. She couldn't outrun them. The world narrowed to the man's expectant gaze and the horrifying weight of his offer. This wasn't just a threat to her body. It was an assault on the last vestiges of her spirit, fragile as spun glass. She wanted to scream, but her throat was locked tight. She wanted to disappear, to become one with the dust and the heat. The silver glinted in the sun, a vile temptation in the face of her absolute helplessness. Just as the silence stretched taut, ready to snap, another sound reached them. The steady, rhythmic thud of a horse approaching at a measured pace. Not fast, not panicked, just arriving. The Apache men turned, their faces remaining stoic but a subtle tension entering their postures. Alara's eyes flickered towards the sound, a flicker of bewildered hope, quickly extinguished by the sheer impossibility of help appearing out of this emptiness. Who would be here? Who would dare interfere? A lone rider emerged from the heat haze, a man on a sturdy bay horse. He wasn't fast or showy, just steady. He wore plain, trail-worn clothes, a wide-brimmed hat pulled low, obscuring his face until he was closer. He carried no visible rifle, only a worn saddlebag. He didn't look like a lawman or a trader or anyone with authority. He just looked like a man traveling. He reined in his horse maybe 20 yards from the group, dismounting slowly, deliberately. He didn't look at Alara, didn't look directly at the Apaches. His gaze seemed fixed somewhere beyond them, towards the horizon. He was tall, lean, with a stillness about him that was unnerving. He didn't speak. He didn't make a move towards them. He simply stood there, holding his reins, his presence a quiet, immovable stone in the path of the unfolding transaction. The old Apache man didn't lower the pouch. He studied the newcomer, a flicker of annoyance or calculation in his eyes. The air hummed with unspoken challenge. The newcomer finally shifted his weight, his boots crunching softly on the dry earth. He still didn't look at anyone, He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a tin cup. Then, without a word, he walked past the Apaches towards the small, creaky well pump near Alara's shack. He ignored their presence utterly, as if they were no more than fence posts. He began to pump water, the squeak and groan of the old mechanism cutting through the tension. The sound was ordinary, mundane, yet in this context, it felt like an act of defiance. He filled his cup, took a long drink, and then, still not looking at anyone, poured the rest onto the thirsty ground. Only then did he turn his head, his gaze finally sweeping over the group. His eyes were pale, almost gray, under the shadow of his hat brim. They were calm, steady, and held a depth that Alara couldn't fathom. He didn't say a word, but his posture, his stillness, the quiet act of simply being there spoke volumes. He wasn't armed in the conventional sense she expected, but there was a power in his composure, a silent refusal to acknowledge the legitimacy of the moment unfolding between the Apache leader and herself. The old Apache's face tightened almost imperceptibly. He looked from the newcomer to Alara, back to the newcomer. The weight of the silence returned, but now it was different. It was charged with the newcomer's inexplicable presence. The moment stretched, long and fragile. The sun continued its descent, casting long, distorted shadows. The three Apache men exchanged glances. The old leader studied the quiet man by the well. There was no aggression in the newcomer's stance, no challenge issued in words. Only the stark, undeniable reality of his presence. It was as if he had appeared solely to witness, and in his witnessing, he disrupted the balance. The air grew heavy with the decision being made. Finally, with a sharp sigh, the old Apache man lowered the pouch. He didn't return it to his saddlebag immediately. He looked at Alara one last time, a look that promised consequences for her perceived role in this interruption, then turned his gaze back to the newcomer. He spoke a few rapid words in his language, too quick for Alara to catch. The newcomer remained silent, his pale eyes steady. The Apache leader then mounted his horse. Without another word, the three men turned and rode away, the dust cloud forming again in their wake, receding back into the vast, indifferent landscape. Alara stood frozen, watching them go. The terrible weight in her chest eased, but her legs felt weak, like straw. She looked at the man by the well. He was still standing there, watching the receding dust. He didn't look towards her. He didn't offer a word of comfort or explanation. He just stood. Relief warred with confusion and a fresh wave of fear. Who was this man? Why had he come? And why had his silent presence been enough to turn away the threat? She couldn't comprehend it. He hadn't drawn a weapon, hadn't spoken a word of protection, yet his arrival had shifted everything. He finally turned, his gaze meeting hers for the first time. There was no curiosity, no judgment in his eyes, only a quiet sort of weariness. "They won't come back tonight," he said, his voice low and calm, rough around the edges like worn leather. It was the first sound she had heard him make beyond the well pump, and its ordinariness was strangely grounding. "But this ain't a safe place for a woman alone." He stated it not as an accusation, but a simple fact as undeniable as the dust on the ground. Alara found her voice, though it was barely a whisper. "Why?" she managed. "Why did you?" He cut her off, not unkindly, but with finality. "Ain't right," he said, his gaze sweeping over the desolate land, the fragile shack. A soul alone out here, facing. That he didn't elaborate on that. But they both knew what he meant. He paused, then added, "Name's Silas." Alara nodded, her throat tight. "Alara," he didn't offer his hand. He simply picked up his saddlebag again. "Reckon I'll make camp here for the night. My horse needs water and, well, it ain't right." He walked towards the small, flat area near the well, dropped his bag, and began to unsaddle his horse with practiced, unhurried movements. He wasn't asking for permission. He was stating his intention. Alara watched him, bewildered. Was he staying to protect her, or simply because it was convenient? His face remained unreadable, etched with lines that spoke of hard weather and long trails. There was no softness in him, but there was a quiet competence, an unyielding quality that had, just moments ago, stood between her and a horrifying fate. She didn't know if she should be grateful or terrified of this new, unknown element in her precarious existence. But for the first time since her husband had been taken by fever, she didn't feel entirely alone. The vast emptiness still surrounded them, but his quiet presence filled a small part of it, a temporary, fragile bulwark against the harsh realities of the world. She retreated into her shack, the flimsy door feeling suddenly inadequate, but she didn't bar it. She watched him through the grimy windowpane as he expertly set up a small, discreet camp as dusk began to paint the sky in hues of orange and purple. Night fell, thick and heavy, bringing with it a silence deeper than before. Alara lay on her cot, listening, to the wind, to the creak of the shack, and to the small, occasional sounds from Silas's camp outside. The soft snort of his horse, the quiet crackle of a minimal fire he had built. She didn't sleep. Fear still coiled in her belly, but it was different now. Less the raw terror of immediate violation, more the lingering anxiety of uncertainty. Who was Silas? He hadn't asked her questions, hadn't pried into her circumstances. His focus seemed solely on the pragmatic water, a place to rest. Yet, his intervention had been decisive. Ain't right, the phrase echoed in her mind. A simple statement, devoid of grand pronouncements or heroic bluster. It seemed to stem from a quiet, internal code. In the pale light of dawn, she emerged cautiously. Silas was already up, tending to his horse. He glanced at her, a brief, neutral look. "Mornin'," he said. His voice was still low, unremarkable. He didn't offer her coffee, didn't make small talk. He simply went about his business. Alara hesitated, then walked to the well herself, needing water to wash and prepare the meager breakfast she could afford. As she worked the pump, he finished with his horse and began to saddle it. A fresh wave of anxiety washed over her. Was he leaving? Now that the night had passed, was his sense of right fulfilled? He finished saddling the bay, tightened the cinch, and ran a hand along its neck. Then he turned towards her. Those men, they might think twice, but they might not forget. His pale eyes met hers, clear and steady. "You still alone out here?" She nodded, unable to form words. "Lost my husband months ago. Fever." He didn't offer sympathy, just accepted the fact. He looked around the small, struggling homestead. The dry patch that passed for a garden, the flimsy fences, the isolation that screamed her vulnerability. "You got family? Somewhere to go?" he asked. She shook her head. "None that are left or would take me in." The shame of her poverty, her lack of connections, was a heavy burden. He considered her for a long moment. His gaze wasn't prying, but assessing, like a man evaluating the lay of the land. "This land. It's hard," he said slowly. "Harder still on your own." He paused, and Alara held her breath, not knowing what to expect. Was this leading to a proposal of some kind? A demand for payment? He finally spoke, his voice quiet. "I ain't got much to my name. Drift mostly. Seen a lot of country. Seen a lot of folks broken by it." He looked away then, towards the rising sun. "But what happened yesterday? Ain't right. Still ain't right, you bein' here alone like this. It's a clear invitation for trouble." He turned back to her. "I ain't off-errand charity," he stated, his voice firm, preempting any potential misunderstanding. "I could use a place to shelter sometimes, a bit of stability. And you need a man's presence here. Someone who ain't afraid to stand in the way." He looked around again. The work needs doing. Fences mended, land cleared, maybe a proper well dug if there's water deeper down. He was laying out a proposition, stark and practical. A partnership born of necessity, not sentiment. "I ain't lookin' for a wife," he added, as if reading her mind, his tone flat and final on the matter. "And I ain't expectin' anything other than shared burden and mutual protection. My presence here, your claim providing shelter." Alara stared at him, stunned. It wasn't a romantic rescue, not a knight on a white horse. It was a negotiation, a transaction of needs. his quiet protection in exchange for a place to stop drifting. It lacked warmth, lacked comfort, yet it offered something she desperately needed: a shield, a chance to survive without constant, gnawing fear. She thought of the Apache men, of the glinting silver, of her utter helplessness. She looked at Silas, his face unreadable, his pale eyes steady. He wasn't offering her affection or salvation, but a grim, necessary alliance. It was a lifeline extended with calloused hands. Is this because you're a God-fearing man?" The words slipped out before she could stop them, driven by her confusion about his motives. He looked surprised by the question, a flicker of something unreadable crossing his face. "God-fearing." He repeated the word as if testing its taste. "I ain't much for preachin'. Seen too much hard proof that prayer don't stop bullets or thirst." He paused, looking out at the vast sky again. "But I believe there's a right way and a wrong way in this world. And taking advantage of the vulnerable, the alone. That's the wrong way. It offends something deep down." He didn't elaborate further, but his quiet conviction was more powerful than any sermon she had ever heard. It wasn't piety. It was a fundamental sense of justice, hard-won and deeply ingrained. He was offering her protection not out of religious dogma, but a simple, inherent belief in what was right. Her decision was made not by emotion, but by cold, practical calculation and the memory of absolute fear. "All right, Silas," she said, her voice gaining a little strength. "All right, we can try." It wasn't a joyful agreement, but a solemn pact. He gave a single, short nod. "Then I'll stay." For now, he didn't make a promise beyond the immediate. Survival out here was day by day. But for today, she wasn't alone. The partnership was forged in silence and necessity, two broken vessels finding a way to weather the storm together. He untied his horse from the fence where he'd left it and led it towards a patch of sparse shade. He wasn't leaving. A fragile hope began to unfurl within her, tentative but real. The days that followed settled into a rhythm dictated by the sun and the demanding land. Silas wasn't intrusive. He spoke little, and when he did, it was usually about practical matters: the weather, the state of the tools, the distant sound of thunder. He worked from sunup to sundown, steady and tireless. He mended the fences with strong hands, cleared brush with an economy of motion, and began the back-breaking work of digging a new well, his pickaxe ringing against the stubborn earth. Alara worked alongside him sometimes, hauling water, preparing their simple meals, learning to anticipate his needs from his movements rather than his words. Dialogue was sparse, weighted, often conveying more through silence and gesture than speech. She observed him constantly, piecing together the man behind the quiet exterior. His hands were scarred, his movements efficient. He kept his few possessions neatly, his rifle clean and always accessible, though still not openly displayed. He never wasted food or water. He seemed to have an innate understanding of the land, the weather patterns, the subtle signs of the wild. He was capable, resourceful, and utterly self-contained. She saw him pause sometimes in his work, looking out at the horizon, his expression thoughtful, distant. What had he seen in his travels? What had made him choose this desolate place, this uncertain arrangement? He never offered personal details, and she didn't ask. Their bond was built on shared labor and the unspoken agreement for mutual survival. Her fear began to recede, replaced by a quiet determination. His presence was a constant, solid reassurance. The threat of the Apache men, while still a chilling memory, felt less imminent with Silas nearby. She learned to handle his rifle under his patient, silent guidance, the weight of it in her hands no longer a symbol of helplessness, but a tool of defense. He showed her how to track, how to read the signs of who or what had passed through the area. He wasn't just protecting her. He was equipping her. He respected her claim, never overstepped boundaries, physical or otherwise. The God-fearing quality she had glimpsed seemed less about religious observance and more about a quiet, unwavering moral compass. He simply did what he saw as right, without fanfare or expectation of reward. One scorching afternoon, weeks into their arrangement, a rider appeared. Not the Apaches this time, but two rough-looking men on dusty horses, the kind who drifted from one trouble spot to the next. They stopped at the edge of the property, eyeing the shack, then Silas working at the well. Their presence felt immediately predatory. Alara felt the old fear prickle, but it was different now, sharper, mixed with a surge of protectiveness for the fragile stability they had built. Silas straightened, his hand casually dropping towards his side, where his rifle now rested leaning against the well housing. He didn't challenge them, didn't speak. He just watched them, his posture still, ready. The lead man, a burly fellow with a cruel grin, called out, "Here tell a woman's settlin' this claim alone. Reckon she could use some company." His eyes flickered towards Alara, standing near the shack entrance, her face pale but resolute. Silas took a step forward, placing himself more directly between the riders and the shack. "She ain't alone," he said, his voice still quiet, but with an edge of steel that hadn't been there before. He didn't raise his voice, didn't make a grand gesture. He simply stated the fact of his presence, and the subtle, unwavering threat it contained. The riders hesitated, looking at Silas. There was nothing outwardly intimidating about him, no bravado, just that quiet stillness, the hand near the rifle, the steady, pale gaze that met theirs without flinching. It was the look of a man who was dangerous not because he sought trouble, but because he was entirely prepared to face it. The burly man's grin faltered. He exchanged a look with his companion. They were predators looking for easy prey. Silas wasn't easy. He was the unexpected thorn. The silence stretched, thick with tension. Alara watched, her heart pounding, but her hand didn't tremble this time. She clutched a heavy iron skillet, ready if needed. She saw the calculation in the rider's eyes, the weighing of risk versus reward. Silas remained a statue of quiet resolve. The burly man spat on the ground. "Ain't worth the trouble," he muttered, loud enough for them to hear. He wheeled his horse around. "Let's ride." Without another word, they spurred their horses and galloped away, leaving only dust behind. Alara let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Silas watched them go until they were specks on the horizon. Then he turned back to the well, picked up his pickaxe, and resumed his work as if nothing had happened. Alara walked towards him. "Silas," she said, her voice steady. "Thank you." He paused, leaning on the handle of the pickaxe. He met her gaze, and this time, there was a flicker of something in his pale eyes she hadn't seen before, perhaps a hint of acknowledgement, maybe even a subtle understanding. "Just doing what's right, Alara," he said, his voice softer now, returning to its usual calm cadence. "It ain't right for folks like that to prey on others." It was his code again, simple and profound. In that moment, standing beside him under the vast, indifferent sky, Alara felt a sense of strength she hadn't known she possessed. She was no longer just the vulnerable woman alone on a desolate claim. She was Alara, a woman who had faced down fear, who had found an unlikely ally, and who was learning to stand her ground. The partnership forged in desperation had deepened into something resilient, a quiet understanding and mutual respect that needed no grand declarations. The land was still harsh, the future still uncertain, but she faced it not with despair, but with a quiet, hard-earned resolve. Silas returned to his digging, the rhythmic clang of the pickaxe a comforting sound in the vast silence. They were two solitary figures against the immensity, but together, they were weathering the storm. Her resilience, coupled with his unwavering sense of what was right, had created a fragile, yet potent, force against the cruelty of the world. The struggle wasn't over, not truly, but she no longer felt like prey. She was a survivor, standing firm on her patch of earth, side by side with the quiet, God-fearing man who simply believed in doing what was right. And in this harsh, unforgiving land, that was more than enough. It was everything.